of peaceful societies. But as you know, this 2.5-day conference will end with a roundtable facilitated by Françoise Benadou, our president, which will deal with how to recreate hope for young people. So there is a lot of progress, but we do say from the start that hope could be at the heart of our discussions. Well, I won't do any advertising, but it's a book really we'll never find again. So 5-6 years ago, I wrote a book, A World of Violence, which in fact was against the idea about the end of the world, the end of history. The history was going to stop and the world was going to be a peaceful place. And I did not believe in that. And I thought the world was not composed of indifferent individuals, but they experience or express violence which were expressed throughout the following years. And we're just reaching a peak of violence in the last few months, especially in terms of geostrategy, but also in a large number of countries where women, and all other excluded individuals suffer from, injustice, unjust situation. And so this is why we're going to have a discussion, a 1-hour discussion, which will start with Dr. Bay. Dr. Bay is president of Amnesty International, so we all know Amnesty International. She will talk about it for a minute, but she will mainly afterwards mention the role of NGOs to regain hope in a situation where there are a lot of violence, rampant pregnant violence, war, conflict, social fractures, and this is what we must pull out of this. And NGOs do play a major role in our society by being a clear illustration thereof. Then after that, if you agree, and even if you don't actually, Lionel Zinsou, who is an eminent economist, a friend of the Cercle for a few decades now, who had an amazing career as a French and in working in ministries, or he was also an industrialist and also a financier today, and then he was Prime Minister of Benin with a lot of talent. Everything he does it with talent, and he will talk about another form of violence, which is the violence experienced by African societies vis-à-vis poverty, and how when facing such difficulties, how is it possible to basically rethink the world and find new solutions through a form of expression which carries hope and positive views. And finally, Mrs. Chani, who again was an exceptional woman, a great friend of Philippe Allion, whom I see here, great for us here. And she will talk about the suffering of women in a country she knows well, a bit that she knows well, but she will explain to us, and this is why she will be right at the heart of our discussion, the role of youth in the world. How can we react, change things, and by being alive through this new rising of the youth, which will play a key role. By the way, I want to say that youth will be at the heart of our reflection throughout the 2.5 days. And as you know, we will have 2 specific sessions on youth that will take place on Sunday. So this was the introduction of my 3 colleagues. They're great. I mean, I'm sure they are. Now, Dr. Bae will talk to us about what we should think about Amnesty International and NGOs in general. Thank you, Madame. You have the floor.
Merci, Professor. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join all of you. I live in Malaysia, and I must say, I am surprised at the temperature here. It's rivaling my country, and maybe that's a nod to the climate change that we're all facing. So, you know, a lot of times the human rights issue in itself is sort of a tension between people of conviction, you know, behind and about human rights, and skeptics. And I think Catherine Sikink's work is very, very fascinating, where because we're becoming better and measuring more human rights impact, the world tends to think it's getting worse. But if you compare the past to the present, there's a lot of studies that show that genocide and violence against civilians have reduced. Access to healthcare and education have increased. So she makes the argument that a lot of technical, philosophical, psychological considerations make it a bit opaque, and a lot of academics are currently working on that. I would argue that there have been, you know, especially with COVID receding, there's been a resurgence in powerful movements, women, life, freedom in Iran, that, you know, has no shortage of providing inspiration and hope for people. And I would argue that activists have made quite a difference in human well-being, you know, historically. And a lot of times there's also a criticism that human rights, the neoliberalism, it has its antecedents in the West, but actually the Americas, Latin America has played a very, very important role. It is a global phenomenon. And when we talk about the climate and everything that we're facing, none of us can get through one sector of society focusing on it. It takes all of us bringing it together. And Professor, you asked you know, a question like what NGOs and Amnesty included are doing. And in the past, sometimes we were thought of as maybe too intellectual or too distant. And you know, I'm a psychologist, I'm a trauma specialist. Words matter. How you frame the argument. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. He survived the Holocaust, he went on to be a psychiatrist. And essentially, in a nutshell, what he says is that it is not anything that anybody does or that happens to you that determines how you feel. It's essentially how you think about it. So the framing matters. You know, when you think of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, a lot of times these arguments are won if it feels true, as opposed to just facts. So I think NGOs are and need to continue paying attention to messaging. One of the questions is, you know, what is the cost if all of us in this room don't get behind human rights? A lot of research has shown that when you ask about human rights, people think of it as abuses. But another frame to think about it is as essential rights that you have since you're born. So the framing, you know, instead of, and the theme is hope. So instead of problems, solutions. Instead of intimidation, innovation. Showing people on the ground that are not remote or sort of hierarchical, normal, common people that are making a difference. And these messages, they really, really do resonate. And you know, you want to think locally, act globally. So for example, we have an Amnesty, strong Amnesty office in France. And when we survey the French people, they equate Amnesty in France with freedom and democracy. So you frame the message as such, and the arguments will be won by people who shape the parameters. So I will just say as a psychologist that what you resist persists. So we need to think very carefully instead of anger, which actually makes people shut down and lose hope and a conservative response. Having hope-inspired messages is a very effective emotion in inspiring empathy. So I'll stop there.
Lionel, your turn. Professor, Mrs. President, distinguished guests and friends. First, biographic correction. I spent less time in being Prime Minister than preparing my PhD under the control of Professor Lorenzi. Actually, it so happened that was 45 years ago, so okay, doesn't help, clearly. But anyway, Madam, I'm very impressed by the fact that Amnesty International, which deals with some of the most difficult situations and attacks against human rights, through you, Madam, is sending a very positive message, hopeful message on innovation against intimidation. I think this is a beautiful phrase, and I would like to thank you for everything you do at the head of Amnesty International and for having opened this rencontre on this tone. So let me add to this okay. Well, to talk about, I want to talk about Africa. So Africa, well, there is something striking in Europe is that we always it's always the orientation of information about Africa is all about hopelessness, about violence, about death, about damages and the exceptional damages caused by climate change, around the weakness of this continent, which is basically guilty for nothing of what is happening now to it. Well, climate change is a great example thereof. We are among the weakest producers of problems and for being to correct everything that is negative and happening to us. You know, the collapse of crops yield, the erosion of coastlines, the volatile aspect of weather conditions, which cause, of course, significantly impact the food resources and so on and so forth. Of course, wars, conflicts, the unsafe situation in the Sahel or in Eastern Africa, in the Horn of Africa, and this, this war that has caused probably more than 3 million deaths in the Republic Democratic of Congo under all possible regimes for all possible reasons, and we're still very active. So this is the prism, the facets through which Europe looks at Africa with its violence and despair. But we should be cautious about having some kind of a historical vision about Africa in terms of risk. It should not be used by Europe or the West to accept a form of decline. We should not consider Africa as being hopeless to somewhat boost optimism in the West. So maybe should we look at well, it seems to me, says the speaker, two prerequisites when we examine the position of Africa. First, you need to know it. And it's amazing the amount of ignorance actually that prevails, and the other one is to respect Africa as well. So some progress have been made about knowledge, but the economists here, I do invite them to help Africa to be known, contribute to a better knowledge about Africa. One thing that penalizes is the fact that the scoring agencies do not know us and do not consider us. Well, it's a bit of a problem, but it can be easily measured because on the equal score, our condition to access financial markets involve rates, borrowing rates, versus the other emerging countries and the other continents, developing continents. There is always an additional risk premium, or there is aspect of non-competitiveness, difficulties to create the budgetary space or framework necessary. Very often we are considered as having very high risk level. Now, when we look at the economic studies or surveys, it so happens in terms of capital yield, Africa versus the other emerging countries, Africa has a mean profitability slightly higher, actually. It so happens that in terms of the risk of failure and volumes of such failures, financial failures, we are the continent with the lowest financial risk. Well, in the current period, we are, well, there is no access to the financial market for Africa. So there are some major countries in Africa which face a tricky situation. Egypt, you know, the second economic power of the continent, or the good kids, you know, of growth, such as Ghana. But this over-assessment of the African risk dates back to before that. They'll give you example of Zambia and Eritrea, who are a country with huge debts and with defects, but they're 1% of the GDP of Africa, these two countries together, and there are contagion effects of the most vulnerable situations versus the most robust situations. So it'd be good, actually, especially in the economic field, to learn and to know Africa. There are other domains where, well, better knowledge is required. A study was done by an economist and a sociologist from Sweden, Hans Rosling, who's called Factfulness, which has not been translated into French. Knowledge about the developing world from surveys in several countries. Well, this knowledge is actually very weak, very low, because there is some kind of snapshot, you know, of a frozen frame, you know, of a knowledge of the world, not about the state of knowledge or the status of knowledge of the teachers of people who today are being surveyed. But what is more difficult is about the knowledge of the teachers who train their teachers. Well, it's a bit worrying, if you want. Basically, there is a sort of a frozen frame, and you know, this is what you were teaching me in 1978, dear professor. So some countries, you know, are somewhat ahead, like the Scandinavian countries, but France or the States, the major European powers, are in fact among those who have the oldest knowledge level, not knowledge of 2023. So first reminder, I think, clearly, if you want to build hope, it would be a good idea to know the sources of your lack of hope. I think that would be the consider people is important. In the Paris summit on June 23rd, President Cyril Ramaphosa, about the new financial pact, this idea of President Macron to try to recreate trust among developing countries, and versus some loss of faith and promises not fulfilled by Western countries. He says, I feel like a beggar. I'm treated like a beggar. I'm not a beggar. So basically, we're not beggars. Let's face it, we're not. But this is the way people look at us, the West, the international institutions. We're members thereof, we're often shareholders, you know, and therefore, well, maybe it would be to have special currency draw to finance energy transition. They look at us like, you know, by the FMI, you know, who a few months said openly, you know, now they're saying it, but, you know, as beggars. So you're begging for special currencies for your development banks, you know. You want to contribute to global inflation. Well, if the world inflation was limited to African countries, it would be very low. Today in my country, there was quick response to the adaptation to the to the adaptation to the war in Ukraine and the condition that resulted from that. Inflation is at 3%. You know, some countries in Africa have high inflation, but you know, we have nothing to do. We're not contributors to the world inflation. So this notion of respect are clearly essential. The fact that we to ask for the pre-colonial art objects which were pillaged during the colonial period, you know, if they can be returned to us, well, that's a great consideration for our history. Well, something you should bear in mind, there is something you should bear in mind, and which helps us to have hope for Africa. Basically, we were colonized, fair enough, by expeditionary forces which were minute. Why? Because at the time of the colonial scramble in the second half of the 19th century, there were less than 30 million Africans, over 300 million square kilometers. For those who have imperial dreams today, and there are some powers which go back to imperial dreams, well, I'll tell them, careful, cautious. To colonize a continent is better when there is one inhabitant per square kilometer. So don't speculate on the fact that Russia is becoming Russia again. It's a European fantasy when it's we want to talk about Africa. Russia does not invest, has no budget for development support, but Russia does exports only 2 or 3 products, significant, fair enough, fertilizers and gas and cereals in Africa, by the way. Yeah. It's more difficult in the rest of the world. It is the shadow of what the Soviet Union was, which did not scare us at the time. So the neo-Ottomanisms, you know, and the imperial dreams of a new power, you know, don't be scared, and it doesn't scare us. Forget about your Chinese phobia. China is not recolonizing Africa. Ignore that, you know, pull out of that fear, you know, and if you stop fear, you build hope. Let me remind you one detail. The trade deficit of Europe vis-à-vis China is abysmal, sorry. Oh yes, you have to stop me. Sorry, I've got 1 minute 30 left. Remember one thing, trade deficit of the US over China is $800 billion. Remember that in an average period, trade between China and Africa is balanced. For a simple reason, is that for the time being, China is not interested by us as a market. The market, it's you, not us. We provide the raw materials of the factory of the world so that goods will be sold to you. So do not project European realities. Often, you know, young men from great international institutions say resist against the Chinese pressure. I said, you come from the US, from France? Do you have a PhD from MIT? Because I want to say, you know, $800 billion, you know, make an effort in the US. Come on, get better. So why is it interesting that through consideration and knowledge, we should try to rebuild confidence and hope together, because Africa is 3 things. First, the fact that we have a very dynamic demography. And, you know, I'm not young, says the speaker, so I'm one in the last percentile, under 65. So, yeah. So I'm not representative of Africa as such, as the speaker, but I'm sure there will be many African students in the room and who are representative thereof. What's important is not that we have a huge demographic growth. You'll be 2 billion, okay, it scares half of the room. Well, but it doesn't matter. What's important is that we do have less and less children, because our demographic growth is based on the extension of lifespan, of life expectation, not of fecundity, which drops everywhere in Africa. What's interesting is that we are the continent which has the lowest non-active citizen, supported by active citizen. And this will continue with a structure which in itself generates savings and means to invest. The second asset after human asset is, okay, we have 3 or 4 times growth than the European Union, but that's secondary. It's not the point. The fact that our inactive assets become active. For example, the Sahara Desert, for the deserts, it could be sources of energy. I will. So, second asset, simply the space. Thank you, madam. So, our deserts are worth something. Our mangroves, the fact that we do not touch the jungle is unique in the world. We have assets which did not exist as economic values. And the last thing, if you want, is that we are early adopters of technologies. Don't worry about the fact that look at telcos and their utilization, digital currencies. We can be something that you see as, illiterate, but today we be among, very much like in China, those who adopt the fastest new technologies. So what economist historian called the advantage of being backward, well, becomes an advantage. You go from archaism to some form of Neolithic or Iron Age to digital, and it creates a bit of hope, Mr. President.
Abnou, if you can do your presentation, and please try to give some thought already, because we'll have a 20-minute discussion session. And so everything that is discussed now and raises a lot of questions. So please give some thought to all this for our discussion period. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invite. I think that you know what we're talking about here, so I have to be careful. I'm from the Orient, so I have to be careful with the time that is allotted to me. So hope, yes, it's there, but we just don't see it anymore in our liberal democracies. Obviously, Ukraine, at the moment of the invasion by Russia, was an electroshock, but this shock did not come from the fact that there was a war on our continent, even though if we've forgotten about the wars in Yugoslavia, genocides that took place not that long ago, even if we tend to forget the war that we suffer from Islam on the European territory that was started with the 11th of September in America, but that hit the sidewalks of Nice, London, and Spain. But the fact that, what's important is Zelensky didn't want a taxi, he wanted weapons. So we have a European there that said, I'm there, I'm going to stay there, and more than that, I'm going to fight. And this electroshock that he sent us made us become aware that even while we are, complaining and everything, that there were people very close to us that fought to live like we do, to live under the auspices of our liberal democracies. And that was a very important moment that we need to recall, that we need to be reminded of, that a lot of people live and are fighting to access liberal democracies, or the liberal democracy. Democracies that enable to live, to love, to create, to innovate, and to allow for this simple thing that looks like nothing, to vote, the simple capacity of voting. So I think hope is there. And in fact, Russia does not represent a threat, because we haven't seen lines of refugees trying to enter Russia to seek for the status of refugee. Same thing in Turkey. You don't have in these new fantasy empires You don't have lineups of refugees that want to enter these countries, but we have people who line up because they want to access a better life for their children, better studies for their children. And that's in Europe. So even though I was born in this country and that the Mullahs really affected my parents and I ended up coming here, it's something fantastic for me to be here. But there is a movement in my country of origin. We tend to forget it. As a historian, you know, I always go back to history. There were the student revolts in the 90s that were repressed, the Green Movement following the undue re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad that caused the death of many. There was this moment of hope, incredible moment, at the signing of the Vienna agreements in 2015, and why the Iranian population was in the streets and was happy, because there was a promise of a liberalization of the economy in Iran. And they were ready, while the mullahs and the revolution keepers were not ready for that, because the mullahs and the keepers hold the gun and the economic weapon, because they hold 90% of the Iranian economy. The Tehran airport is at 90% of the ownership of the guardian of the revolution. So when they have this power, there's not much you can do. The Iranians hoped for reform. They revolted. And why do I say that it was a revolution? And even that the revolution has taken place in Iran. Why? Because a revolution, for it to happen, is you have to have a revolution of the mentalities. Monarchy, because it works based on a monarchy regime with mullahs instead of kings, fell off, collapsed in the mentalities, in the minds of the Iranians. They want to kick out these people from their thrones. Be reminded that in 1999, the Islamic Revolution took 17 months to take place. And the French Revolution, you should remember, started in Easter 1739, when Louis XV refused to confess and to take communion, which gave rise to a desacralization of his power as absolute monarch, enabled the libertarians that were just waiting for that to publish caricatures and things that enable up to the onset of the Republic to make religious absolutists collapse. I know I don't have much time, but you know, and they managed little by little to overrun. Good news, this new Iranian revolution will take less time than the French Revolution, thanks to new technologies, thanks to the speed that changes everything. But a revolution is a revolution, and it always follows the same track. And what's important is the change of mentalities. I think that the revolution started when the first scarf was burned, when the women started dancing in the streets, when I saw school children, university students destroy the walls in the canteens that separated men and women. And this is what enables autocracies to survive. And based on the same model as the Iranian youth, we talk about a country where the youth is very strong, very present. I come from prehistory compared to this youth, and I'm thinking of this creativity, this desire for this of democracy of people in Taiwan, Hong Kong, in Burma, in Thailand, all this youth that has creativity in their democratic will, and that's quite moving. And this movement that started with a Thai comedian that spread out to the whole of Southeast Asia, which is the Milk Tea Alliance, the alliance of the milk tea. It's just a simple idea, a very simple claim, very symbolic. It says that in China, you only drink black tea. The tea is black. In Taiwan, you always add milk. Oh, or tapioca. In Hong Kong, you add milk. In Thailand, very sweet and cold. In Burma, you drink it cold and sweet or with a cloud of milk. And the fact of joining this hashtag corresponded to ask for a change, to plead for singularity, a will to be who you are, what you are, be able to say what you want, and make claims. And that's what a liberal democracy is. It's praising singularity, the fact of being able to drink tea with tapioca pearls, for example, and even, I don't know if you follow in India, for example, 3 centuries of history of the Mughal period were erased from history books. So the Mughal emperors just disappeared from the schools in India. They were just erased. So when you tell the children who built the Taj Mahal, they'll say, "Oh, we don't know," because it was an emperor, a Mughal emperor, that built the Taj Mahal. In India, it's called the Masala Chai. They've joined this milk tea alliance. It looks like nothing, but it summarizes very well what is a liberal democracy, what it means, what people are asking for. It's not much. I think we are really tired in our liberal democracy. We forgot the luck we have. We're here. We can say what we want for as long as you want, the way we want, and the only risk we have is not to be invited the year after. You know, this can happen. There'll be no torture, no jailing. There will be no police forces waiting for us to bring us into jail, to take us into jail. So this youth in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, that we have abandoned. We've abandoned to the extent that today the pro-Chinese government in Hong Kong proposes 1 million yuan. That's about 117,000 euros for any information enabling to bring back into the country refugees, Hong Kong refugees that are in Australia or England. But since Sweden is not in NATO yet, because Erdogan wants to get back his refugees, we're not there yet. Okay, we're a bit weak. Okay, yes, fine. But what's left to us? In the end, to mention the Marquis de Sade, I can say, okay, just another small effort to be proud of being liberal democracies. Thank you. So you all agree that we're starting pretty strong here, aren't we? And that we're in a situation of economic meeting that goes beyond the field of strict economy. So we have 20 minutes now. Open floor. Wonderful to have these 3 personalities that will be invited to come back next year, I promise. You know, it's not that you have the right, you're an owner here, you're a stakeholder here. So who wants to take the floor? I will appoint a person to ask the questions, to address the questions if we have no questions from the floor. Do we have anybody from the floor who has questions? Moon, what's your question? We have a raised hand. Please give a microphone to my friend, the president of Dauphine University. No microphone in the room? Oh my God. So you gave this a lot of thought, right? No, I didn't have time to give this. I played football or soccer, and it's a bit strange to be questioned by you. I thought it was fascinating, these 3 presentations. Fascinating because really we're recreating hope here. We heard the recreation of hope, and I have one question to ask you. Is what are the solutions that you envisage today, whether on the uprising that we see in all the regions of the world that were crushed by whether in Arab countries, in Lebanon, Algeria, or in the places you mentioned that were crushed because of COVID, external variables, which led to the point that the movement stopped. But the hope is still there. How can we make it be reborn, heading for a better world with democracy? So it'd be interesting to have your point of view on this dynamic of hope. And on Africa also, very interesting what was said on Africa, the lack of knowledge we have on Africa. Why do we have this lack of knowledge? There are a lot of works, existing work that are very relevant on poverty in Africa, on a serious topics. Why do we always, what are your ideas to better know Africa? Thank you, that was exceptional for a football player. What I propose now is that you respond, maybe Anjula first. You've used up your time, so Anjula, maybe you can take the floor. Answer this question first.
So I was trying to practice a little bit of human rights on the stage in fighting for the youth that's keeping time and gender equality in terms of airtime. And I just want to actually say really quickly before I attempt to answer your question, you spoke, if I've understood the translation correctly, about children and population. I think that's a really good point and a question to ask ourselves. Are we more concerned about being a great descendant or a fantastic ancestor? And as a psychologist, I speak to a lot of young people all the time, and their parents always tell me they must be going through a phase. They're so angry. I'm like, it's not a phase. They have legitimate reason to be angry, but I think they are the biggest source of hope. And for example, the fact that young people were officially recognized at COP27, and they really fought for that, is just inspiring. And I just wanted to say to your point, Your Excellency, that Martin Kimani, the permanent UN representative from Kenya, he made a very poignant defense on Ukraine's territorial integrity by, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially saying that we must rise from the dead embers of empires and make sure that a new form of oppression and dominance doesn't reoccur. So I really hear you and what you're saying about racism, and also the fact that inequalities are obviously increasing, and economics is a form and a pathway to human rights, but it's not the only way. And sometimes the narrative is between democracy or development, and it shouldn't be or, it should be and. And then to just try to attempt to answer your question. A lot of times, again, people will sort of bash human rights, but there's no other alternative framework that has the intellectual depth, the sophistication that's been enhanced over decades by almost all states, and that's been subjected to so much scrutiny. Our job in human rights is to protect progress, open up spaces, negotiate conflicts, and we are going to do that. And it's very important to reach a critical mass. 10% of the population, and it's a tipping point. And as a psychologist, again, I'll say that we have a fear factor, like our amygdala, understandably. So we're very hypervigilant to threat, also understandably. But we don't focus on all the wins. And it's a skewed, and the news and the media really capitalize that, but it's a skewed perspective of what's actually happening. Again, I have therapy clients that are very afraid to fly. Flying is safer than driving in a car. And actually my homework is go to the airport and watch for 3 hours how many planes take off and land safely. That's never covered. So again, that balance. But from a macro perspective, countries, states tend to vote in blocks. For example, South Africa is taking the lead at the UN on resolutions against racism. The EU is known for taking a lead on technology. But I think the future, we need Global North to genuinely listen openly about what they contribute, how they contribute, their part in the past, and we need broader, more diverse coalitions. And then I think that will be a much needed tipping point. And we have to, I think in this age of Insta everything, Insta dry cleaning, Instagram, we expect it like this. Obviously, you know, if you're living in Ukraine, of course, you want the war to have ended yesterday, I get it. But we have to, in some ways, be content moving the needle even an inch. I live in Malaysia, and we have fought so hard for 15 years unrelentlessly to abolish the death penalty, and now we're there. So I guess I would just end my message by saying, do not give up hope. It's always a choice how we frame it. Are we descending into a black hole, or are we entering into a galaxy of stars? So when nothing is certain, everything is possible.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, so there are many favorable factors, I would say. There's more and more diversity in the actors of change. We're not locked up between national financial resources and public development aid. You know, this is not a prison. We have very robust flows for the remittances, for example, of African migrants, which mobilize more resource than public development aid. And that's not debt. These are donations, remittances. And so these participants are more and more important. During the COVID, it was striking. In the countries of Maghreb, we had a growth, despite the recession, a world recession, an increase in the saving flows set as remittances. And there was the philanthropists. The philanthropists have a systemic impact on our change. Today, you take the Gates Foundation, the Bezos Foundation for Earth, the Rockefeller Foundation, philanthropist that is rising now is MasterCard Foundation, which is gaining momentum. All this is, well, from the US for tax purposes, for fiscal reasons, but the reality is you don't understand the evolution of public health if you don't take into consideration what the Gates Foundation does. They spend more than the World Health Organization. So it's a coalition. And today on the green funding, we are establishing coalitions in which we invest philanthropists' money, so there's subsidies, not debt, to cover the first losses, funds that will be handed out, and private funding that expects a payback. But this coalition enables to lower costs. That'll be essential for energy transition, to cover the risk for long-term projects with a long-term payback. And there are new coalitions. The other factor to speed up change is the fact that you are no longer an actor, a researcher that is isolated somewhere in Benin, because the internet networks have also are now widespread between the CERN in Geneva and the American researchers and the people in Benin. And so today you're in real time, wherever you are, and you're a stakeholder of all innovations, of all progress, wherever you may be. And that's very important. And Africa is a continent where you need to create enterprises, endeavors. So it's a venture continent, a continent of startups, which are not isolated thanks to this connection and thanks to this revolution. So there are new tools to innovate. Lionel will hand over the floor to Luz. No, I think we are not interested in Africa because we lack knowledge. It looks like something we can't address. We are worried. I think, if we, psychologically speaking, the human nature tends to boredom, and we have to re-excite this. You know, to speed up the process as to how to be very pragmatic. I think the problem is that autocracies manage to cut off the heads of the opposition. It's very difficult for those who oppose inside those countries, those autocracies, to survive. So those who survive migrate, and they keep sort of like a dead vision of the country of origin. They're sort of stopped at the moment they left the country, so they can't return, of course, because Karzai, for example, Afghanistan, despite the fact that he was extremely corrupt to the level of art, but he spent too long in Great Britain, and so he lost track of his country. Same thing in Iran. You know, we're playing the partition of the 1970s or 1990s, so the people have lost track. They don't follow the youth. They don't know how much their youth is connected. So I'll say something paradoxal. As a paradox, is the CIA. We miss the CIA. In the time, you have the CIA inside the countries. They knew who was the opposition, who they needed to finance. The CIA. And they made a big mistake with the Taliban when they kicked out the Soviet Union. Made a big mistake, but they knew where what to finance, where the finance should go. We saw that in Ukraine. You win if you have the weapons. So it's difficult to overthrow these regimes without a bloodshed. But I think we have to have an insight information, know who's can represent the future. The countries in Southeast Asia, the countries in Africa, Iran, for example. They have a highly educated youth, and they can represent tomorrow's political class. They have to be identified. They need to be funded, and stop imagining that yesterday can save tomorrow. The youth is there today, and that can work. Thank you. To conclude, first conclusion of the day, obviously the Rencontres d'Aix are not over. First conclusion, I would say we can be in the most difficult situation. Hope is always there. I propose we applaud the members of the panel. Not over. 4 sessions now in the different rooms, so you can go up the stairs, stay here, whatever you want to do. You know, you can join the session you wish. Thank you.
Ah, j'étais payé pour le truc qu'on a fait à Figeac, là. Je vais t'envoyer les sous. Good morning, good afternoon, actually. This session will discuss the global tectonics. We will, the new tectonics of geopolitics. So I will introduce members of the panel. I'll start with Arantxa González-Laya, who is our coordinator today, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain. Give her a round of applause. Thank you. Jean-Marc Olagnier, who is General Director of Accenture, Europe, Africa, Middle East. Melissa Bell, who is a European correspondent, CNN European correspondent based in Paris. Hubert Védrine, who needs no introduction, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hubert Védrine. And Sir Peter Ricketts, who is the former ambassador of Great Britain in France, who is now a member of the Chamber of the Lords. To start the session, let's listen to the former Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Arantxa. Thank you very much. This is not an easy topic. I'll try to decipher if the geopolitical situation is going to take us to a new resurgence of the blocs. Well, first of all, these are times of confusion. There are forces pulling in different directions. We don't know where we're going, and therefore the question is to try to understand such forces, to get to have our words, the words to say, and the way it's going to we're going to shape it. Let me speak about the three forces. First, geopolitics. On the one hand, there is huge rivalry between China and the US, which leads us to thinking about a bipolar, fragmented world. But next to this, there is the rise of a whole series of powers: India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. And they kind of disrupt those bloc logics by they are sort of launching new bridges. They launch new transactional policies to play all the actors. Then the second force is geography. We can see on television East and West, China, US, aggravated by the Russian-Ukraine war, East-West. So centers of interest are technology, which shapes such relations, technology that will enable one or the other to be hegemonic in the future. But next to East and West, there is also North and South. In the South, concerns are somewhat different. Debt and climate change, the impact of climate change. Third force, economy. On the one hand, fields for decoupling, restriction of international trade, such as technologies, but at the same time, international trade, which is breaking records between the US and China, for example, 90 billion last year alone. So a new geopolitical alignment, which is not, which can be seen in economic terms. But to close, Ulysse, one big question: what will be the role of the European Union? Can it play between the two giants, East and West, North and South? Can it be the guarantor of an international trade system based on rules? Questions, but I'm sure there will be plenty of answers. Ulysse, you have the floor. Thank you. Since you're talking about Europe, Arantxa, I will straight away give the floor to Peter Rickett, who will give us his vision. It is true today, as you say, we were in times of confusion. Everything is floating in uncertainty, with two major risks. First, the risk of new conflicts. We already faced that in Ukraine, which could spread somewhere elsewhere in Europe. It's a true threat. And then there is a risk of fragmentation of the world with bloc against bloc logics. There is a word, an expression, which is sort of a buzzword, the global south. You know, we talk about non-aligned country, but now the fashionable buzzword is global south. What is it? Well, we might discuss that. So today, there is a risk of fragmentation of the world. This is why we called it the global tectonics. But there is also the race between climate change and energy transition taking place throughout the world, but which takes time, actually. So this is the theater. Ambassador, how do you see this world in full confusion? And can Europe play a role? Ulysse, a great pleasure to be back in Aix. Let's start with positive aspects. The Ukraine war was a strategic disaster for Putin. NATO is now stronger, more united, wider than it was ever been. Division within the Russian elite are clear. So I think there will be an updating of a defense system and distribution system, the largest ever since the Cold War. The courage of the Ukrainian population and supported with Western weapons destroyed the myth of Russian invisibility. This is essential, and it places us in nearing the end of Putin's regime. I don't know how it's going to take place, but I mean, now I think this is what we are seeing in Europe. We free from our dependence on Russian energy. Second-Wende is spreading in all European countries almost. Europe as a power so wished by our French friends is, well, it's coming, it's taking place even slowly. And even the European-UK relationship are improving following the Withdrawal Treaty, but this Western unity is fragile. Do we have to rely on the solidarity of the European taxpayers or US taxpayers to increase the defense budget on a durable way for the huge cost of reconstruction that will be needed in Ukraine? President Biden is clearly setting up the new protectionist policies and should, especially to block Trump should he come back to power. So Arantxa said there is a key question, that is the increasing confrontations between the US and China, confrontation which is in the economic, financial, technological, and digital domains. For the time being, the European Union, the UK, implement converging policies with China, but could we avoid not making choice? And there is this issue of non-aligned countries, because India is in the north in a way, but very much like South Africa and Brazil, like Saudi Arabia and others, it has decided not to take position. And when it comes to Ukraine, which they considered that the international law of this new space order is of interest to them. This is a warning signal to all that we should not ignore. Now, this leads me to a question, so that we will have time for discussions, and I'm sure there will be questions from the youth. Of course, they will find our position between the US and China. If there is a war in Taiwan, well, we'll be on the US side. that we cannot stay aside, the French president, disregarding the French president, this comment. But is it the right time to push this question of our European strategic autonomy? Strategic, yes, we do have to think about the long-term strategy in Europe, but autonomous? Well, I'm not sure time has come for that. We should think in terms of alliance, in transatlantic European alliance with allied countries in Asia, Australia, Japan, South Korea. And for non-aligned countries, well, we need to listen to them better. We need to understand them. We have to show that their priorities, such as climate change, are our priorities as well, and that state of law is serving their interest. This is a further reason for Putin to lose this war. Well, you do mention the key issue for Europe, that is strategic autonomy. You did mention the role of NATO and the reinforcement of NATO after the beginning of the Russian war. Melissa Bell, you are a CNN correspondent in Paris for Europe. We're a few days from the NATO summit, which will play a key role because of the conflict in progress, but to know if indeed the time could NATO could open its door to Ukraine. How is this perceived, experienced, and in the US, do they talk about this possibility? And this, well, the autonomy, Sir Rickett mentioned it, the gathering that took place of the first year of the war, almost unexpected NATO, which was unified as it had never been and galvanized, because of its ideals and liberal democracy. Yet, I think the more it lasts, we have now front line frozen. We expect determination to fail on one side or the other, and more natural internal division of NATO will be felt, especially in Vilnius, Swedish, the Turkish don't want the Swedish, and and the forces before. Macron said in 2019 that it was NATO was brain dead. NATO experienced there was a revival because there was a war, wanted to fight for ideals, and suddenly attacked, the new space order. But the longer it lasts, but in fact this conflict will show the true failures of the NATO side, the weaknesses. You talked about the BRICS early on. Well, you talked about the BRICS, where we talk about 2/3 of the world population, 50% of the world economy, which today, they come out of this by themselves, aware of their strengths, and this will have indicated the end of this Ukraine confrontation, the idea we had post-Second World War, certainty, natural order, the progress of democracy, liberal order, and contestation is even strong, especially strong because the countries we're talking about do not pay attention to this regional war. They pay attention to other crises, energy crisis, food crisis, climate, global warming. But this confrontation is such that these are challenges that we cannot really tackle today. Well, we can see the main problem, the risk to see this unit around Ukraine getting shattered, and the problems of fragmentation of the world, or even within NATO, and the questioning of globalization. Now, Jean-Marc Colagnier, who is the manager of Accenture for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, now, big corporations, how do they deal with this uncertainty, this risk of new conflicts? Ambassador Rickett talked about the risk of conflict in Taiwan. We can see the world is some kind of, minefield. So how do you do with it? The world is complicated. And for international companies, geopolitics has invited itself in our board of directors and our COMEX for a few years now. Accenture is a company which is present in more than 50 countries in the world, 730 people in the world, one of the first private employer. We are involved in the global south. We're involved in all parts of the world, and we look at geopolitics, as you can imagine, with a lot of interest because it may have an impact on our decisions. A couple of concrete examples on what we had to do. Well, COVID made it possible, strangely enough, to learn a lot about issues of resilience, because within a month, I remember 3 years ago, we get everybody worked at home. It was, in 1 month, we had to shift 730,000 people who worked in our offices, and we learned what it meant to test our resilience. So today, what is going on? Well, today, that's what happened to me. A few years ago, I had to shut down Russia. I had 2,300 employees in Russia. Some of them left. I had to shut down the offices because half of my customers were facing sanctions and the other half were leaving anyway. So I had to close down the offices, shut the offices, and I'm still in touch with my colleagues, former Russian colleagues. Business keeps going, So we try to take a stand as a citizen company. I do have a lot of Ukrainians in Accenture. I'm the largest private employer in Poland, and I have a lot of Ukrainians in Poland. Together with the Polish government, I did a special training for Ukrainian women who were, fleeing from their countries. So we are somewhat supporting a movement of refugees major in Europe, and now our employees are expecting us to get mobilized. So I've signed documents in which my company will be involved in the rebuilding of Ukraine when that will be possible on the digital side, of course. Now, what happens is that the world, as we said, is complicated. It's a bit of a mess, to be honest, to say the least. And we had to learn in our businesses to be resilient. What's essential for us is to keep running, keep our operations regardless of the conditions we face. And I'm rather optimistic, actually. I think our business, our companies, we dealt with that rather well. Today, what we need to do, we talked about energy resilience. This is a major topic in Europe. High price of energy. We talked about supply chain. You've all heard about the supply chain. It's a key problem when we diversify the supply chain to be certain that we can keep working. In my personal experience, the most resilience is that of cybersecurity, because behind the geopolitical tension that experts around the table talk about, there is a digital war. The number of cybersecurity incidents has exploded, and digital security is essential because today, digital is part of all chain of value of company, producing, engineering, supply chain, manufacturing, whatever. So you need to protect businesses, and this is a key topic, a major topic for companies like ours, all companies throughout the world, this to be better protected vis-à-vis a new challenge, a new war, where means are huge, and companies will put a huge, gigantic means, not just to protect their head offices, but throughout the entire chain of value. This is a key element which has to continue, because our concern is that we have to be resilient. We're not too sure about what's going to happen because the macroeconomic models have been explained that business was going to collapse for 2 years, but in fact business is not doing too badly actually. And we knew better times, but anyway, we've been through better times, but we don't know what's going to happen. Macroeconomic models are not fairly clear, very clear, but we need to be resilient on all these aspects I've mentioned, and this is what we work on, mostly the digital aspect, because it's going to be a war, a very nasty war, and it will continue, and it will, a company like ours will have to adapt themselves. We do get adapted, and we're rather optimistic, because the only thing, could there be anything worse? Well, we've seen quite a lot of disasters in the last 3-4 years. Well, so far so good, but I'm confident for the rest. But of course, we'd like more stability. We'd like a bit more stability in the world today. Yes, we keep in mind your optimistic view, but also this underground war and the major problem of cybersecurity for businesses, which is even more difficult to manage than a conventional warfare such as or conflicts like Ukraine. Hubert Védrine, to close this first roundtable discussion. Is this the end of globalization? Are we going to a regionalization of globalization? And for you, is that the world remains dominated by the fight between America and the US? Well, globalization will continue, but in a different way. We're no longer in the Americano globalization, you know, which dominated the last decades, with the illusions of many people, especially in Europe, saying something else. But it's not the end. It's not the closing. It's more fragmentation, diversification. And we can't even think in terms of blocks. It's more complicated. But I would say for me, the main problem for me is the race between the deterioration of life conditions in the world. I'm talking about human beings, and the deterioration of life conditions, not just the climate, but there is the rest, and the race that is the answer, the response, the ecologization, the greening. We talked about the industrialization of all modes of production, you know, all modes of energy, all modes of travel, of mobility. You know, this was going to dominate everything, but it's an illusion. You know, we were delusional when we thought about that. Or can we think about geopolitics or macroeconomics with all the discussions? It's no longer possible. So this will involve everything, everywhere, everybody. Now, down to geopolitics now. The key element, in my opinion, it doesn't change really, but the tectonic plates, you know, are slow to move. You know, the Western countries no longer have the monopoly. You know, it's the monopoly. Europeans talk that it will be international politics is something else. We don't have the monopoly. Otherwise, there would not be what we call in the global south, other than non-aligned, and China could not challenge the others. So we keep huge power, huge wealth, inventivity, but we no longer control the system. So in this system, the US wants to remain number one. The US want to remain with political variation, but they want to remain number one. They don't want another one to become number one, especially China. They do everything in their power to stop that, to block them. So I'm mentioning China, but you know, and this likewise, just as in the Ukraine-Russia Russian aggression was evident, condemned by 140 countries, but 40 countries, which represent 2/3 of mankind, decided not to take stand. And they don't like Putin, they don't like Russia, they don't like war, but they didn't want to make a choice. They don't want to come back automatically to the Western side. Don't be indignated. The history is there. Likewise for China. Several countries in the world don't want to be in the automatic movement of China, and President Macron was right to say that. He was wrong to say it, but he was right to think that we should not be followers, especially nobody knows exactly what will be the US policy towards China in 10 years. Who will be president, on what ground? The Taiwan question might have been maybe disappeared or erased for the reason. So we are in a global situation. There are marked sides, but it could be the non-aligned Europeans about China. They want to pay more attention, but they don't want to be entrained in something. So we're dealing with a world which is difficult to foresee, which is chaotic, which could be dangerous. Consequences for Europe are huge. For example, the Putin's attack has reinvented NATO. He reactivated the spirit of defense in Europe. So this is, he has reorganized the European system. Today, there is no basis for French positions. So, you know, which were argued for years with more energy by Macron, but it was for a long time. So, no, there is no longer any basis. So today, one day, Europeans with Germany, which don't want to have an army, Poland, Ukraine will be in and out, in France, there will be a battle, new battle, original battle on who will get the leadership for security in Europe. the day after tomorrow. So it has nothing to do with the thousands of conferences on European defense based on the idea it was around France. So the French positions, well, visions is, that's why the President adopts different positions in unexpected position on this topic. But France needs a huge restoration or reshuffling program. So in this table I've drawn rapidly, what is most uncertain is Europe. And even if Europe become more realistic, there are less, Teletubbies, they want to be protected by the US, but will it be eternal? They don't want to have to face China, but is it possible? They don't want to reinvent the Pacific coexistence with Russia, but they want to do it, but not just now. And the South, they'd like the South not to tilt on the China side, but French companies are disturbed, weakened by the crisis of representative democracy in all democracies. There is some kind of a violent upsurge of direct democracy, unapplicable with governments which try to invent participative democracy, which has never worked anyway. And unfortunately, those who know least what they want are the Europeans. So they have got lots of nice ideas, but they cannot articulate them. So this is how I see the global vision on the geopolitical situation. In my opinion, Europeans should be able to synthesize their strategic interest, and but they no longer think in terms of strategic interest. And the idea that globalization is the same is good for everybody. No, it's a view of the mind. There is a conceptual work and theoretical political work to be done.
I'm sorry, I'm not really filling you with enthusiasm here. Yes, but you have noted that the subject has been put on the table in great style by all of our speakers. So the question that Hubert Védrine brings to the table is, what about Europe? Europe has managed to remain united whilst Ukraine is being invaded, and it's reinventing itself a little bit by relocating, by jointly producing the vaccines to begin with, and then ammunition for the Ukraine. So there have been many positive changes, but by the same token, Europe really does have to find its voice, which isn't an easy thing. So let me turn back to Arincha, our colleague from Spain. We're thinking about strategic autonomy here and NATO, which is being strengthened thanks to the war in Ukraine. What is the pathway for Europe? Well, let me use a catchphrase here. When I look at myself, I'm a bit kind of sad with what I see, but when I compare myself to others, then perhaps I'm not so unhappy after all. So let's be realistic. We have to be realistic about our strengths, but also our weaknesses. And I think that this starting point is very important, because the very worst thing that could happen would be to imagine that we are stronger than we really are. So we are constantly undergoing construction, but we have also shown our ability to continue to construct. We did that during the 2008 crisis. Oh yes, we were so slow. Yes, it cost such a lot of money. We did that in COVID as well. We managed to have European integration, and as a civil servant at the bottom of the ladder in 1997, I would never have imagined the pooling of our investments in Europe. That is an amazing and a major point. Of course, pessimists will tell us that that was only once, and we've forgotten all about that. Optimists will say, well, it's great, we'll continue like this, as if everything was fine and dandy. Activists, the activists that we should be, must continue to fight every day to strengthen the European Union. All around the world today, between China and the United States, the only way for the European Union and its member states, starting with France, the only way we can survive is to make steps further every day towards a stronger European Union. Yes, it's difficult. Well, it doesn't mean it was easy for the Americans or the Chinese either. You'll have noted that we're talking about the end of the Western monopoly, to use Védrine's words. We haven't really talked about everything. We've talked about the global south, we've talked about the need to discuss more and to have the Europeans' voice heard out in the global south. Ambassador Ricketts, how would you respond to that desire for greater activism? And is Europe obliged to try to choose between China and America? You're British. Does Europe have to choose Washington or Beijing in case of a conflict? Well, let's not forget that we would not have been able to withstand Putin in Ukraine without the States. The States have carried the largest burden in terms of weaponry and also funding for Ukraine up until now. The United States have chosen to refocus on European security. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to focus on China, but they've decided to reinforce their military presence here in Europe. As the minister has said, they've decided to reinvent NATO for a new Cold War. So are we going to stand on the sidelines if there is a confrontation? If there's a conflict between the USA and China about Taiwan? I don't think we will. I don't think we can simply wait for the Americans to be the loyal allies of Europe, whereas we sit on the fence if there's a conflict between them. I'm not saying that we're going to send our troops, no, but it must be clear that it's to our advantage to have the rule of law. And if China invades Taiwan, well, the same question arises, the same problem as with Putin in Ukraine. We will have to take a stance. But as far as the global south is concerned, we have been far too negligent for absolutely years. We have not paid enough attention to the Chinese and the Russian, knowing that they are working in those countries, using with their money, their weaponry. Well, how can we go about being more attentive to the South, the global South? Well, first of all, let's start by not being so obsessed about our European quarrels, such as Brexit, which was a downright mistake, admittedly. But let's listen and let's rise to the challenges of climate, for example. Yes, Hubert Védrine, you wanted to come back on this question of a Chinese-American conflict. Yes, I don't think that this conflict will take place. I think even in a few years down the line, I don't think China would take that monstrous risk of attacking Taiwan, because the United States will be forced to stop them. Otherwise, the American guarantee would not be worth anything anywhere. The Chinese think that they will manage in another way. So I'm not talking about a military scenario here. I may be mistaken. And if there is a military scenario, then the Europeans will not be on the side of the Chinese. That's impossible. But they will do everything to prevent it from happening. There are so many forces in the States and China and Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So that will not take place in that format. It will be much more sneaky, much more undercover. But many people are thinking, and the Pentagon is saying, that China could attack in the beginning of 2027. There will be some anticipated initiatives, and I think it will play out differently. What is the number one likelihood for you, the number one scenario? Well, I think China will move its pawns forward. China threatens Taiwan, has cyber operations, develops a party in Taiwan who doesn't want war. So it will be more backhanded, if you like, a bit sneaky, a complicated type of conflict. But that's not the only scenario. All kinds of things could happen. we signed the Atlantic Alliance. The Europeans asked the Americans for that. We begged the Americans to protect us. And there's Article 5, which meant that the West, there isn't any global alliance with an Article 5 that obliges us to follow the United States anywhere. Otherwise, we would have had to have war in Iraq, and de Gaulle would not have been able to say what he said about Indochina. Perhaps when the time comes, well, if we go with the Americans or we don't, it will be because we will have decided. I think that Macron should have had his own thoughts but kept them to himself. He shouldn't have spoken out. So are we going to manage to create links again with these non-aligned countries? Because here we're not talking about Africa, China. The non-aligned countries cannot be broached as a Western bloc. You have to pick them one by one. So my perspective is not at all the same. Let me just add that whilst waiting to find out what China will or will not do, what Beijing will or will not do in relation to Taiwan, let's not forget the American stance. I think here, with the Ukraine, we had the final shuddering of multilateralism where the United States were trying to lead the world towards something better or more liberal. Finally, the Republican position has always been one of isolationism. And that, in my mind, is what the future will look like. And whilst Beijing is waiting to act or not, the internal forces of the states will have changed a lot. Let's think about this issue of the Ukraine. That was a shadow which showed strength of a people who wanted its freedom, democracy, rather than autocracy. But at the end of the day, Putin's strength, and I think he's nearly at the end of his road, but his strength has been from the very outset, years before this, because this war has just made concrete some things which are underway. Beijing's and Moscow's position has been that we need a multilateral world where autocrats can be autocratic, where institutions in the West were not there to stand on a soapbox and give us lessons. Even in the short term, if Putin is going to lose this war, in the longer term, then that completely different position of minilateralism with certain powers who were unpredictable, unstable, and all of these forces that are prisoners of their own internal instability, they will perhaps decide to act together. So in the longer term, that's what that's Beijing's and Moscow's argument, which is winning out. Well, we'll ask the room for their questions soon, but in the meantime, there's a question that a lot of people are wondering about, Melissa. In a year's time, you've got the American elections. Will Trump win that election? And if he does get back into power, what will that change? Oh, it's so unpredictable. I don't know if that's the worst option. Anything is possible. I think they haven't a clue. They don't know either. But once again, in the Ukraine, the West, like NATO, got all together and powered up behind this scenario, this notion of what democracy is, what this idea of freedom is. But I don't know in the long term if that's going to be enough to compensate those real fractures, the intellectual fractures, and not to mention the economic ones, and ideological fractures within our society. In the long term, I don't think so. A final point with Jean-Marc. Hubert Védrine said that Beijing, Washington will not go to conflict on a head-to-head basis, but there will be like a big game of backgammon. And in backgammon, there's this cybersecurity. We see that the government here in France is worried about TikTok. How are these businesses organizing themselves? We can see the threats, we can see what's at stake, we know that it's necessary to have firewalls. So what does this mean? What are businesses doing? Are they constantly fighting a war against cyber attacks? Well, I prefer to talk about resilience because the concept of resilience, as I've described it, is the main challenge for any society to function properly. We are here to serve our clients, work with our employees. We're responsible also for behaving and acting in our ecosystem. Today, what we really need to understand for businesses is that digital technologies are everywhere. All through the value chain, there it is. The concept which we're developing is protecting your business, the resilience of your business. We need to change business mindsets to take on board this risk management. So as a CEO, what do you say? Well, we're training people. We realize very often that this cybersecurity risk involves a lot of tools, a lot of technology, but it's also a question of training and processes and reviewing the governance of a company. So these are things which one has to take on board in everything we do. Today, we're noticing that most risks that are emerging in reality don't necessarily come from technology, but from men and women, from human beings who haven't applied the processes, who haven't been focused properly from certain parts of a company, for example. So this is a real deep down transformation which is necessary. We've got quantum computing, artificial intelligence. There are going to be more and more opportunities to make these attacks, but it really is a cultural change in our businesses which we need. So all levels are involved. The problem is the weakest link in the chain, of course. And that weakest link is where you'll have your bad surprises. So a lot of technology, yes, but also a lot of training and education. Okay, I'm opening up to the room now. Here we are in a world of major uncertainties. Raise your hand if you have a question. Say who you are and say the name of the person to whom you wish to put your question. Please wait for the microphone before you start speaking. Raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you. I've got a question for all of the panelists. Are you aware that by talking about tectonics, the question wasn't really formulated correctly? I'm not going to talk about the difference between communities and a bloc. A bloc is the Warsaw Pact, where there was no freedom. There was automatic intervention when a country was to leave. The United States did not invade France in '66. And we are not living in a world of blocks. A block means the absence of freedom. It means, like in 14, we are not in that situation. We have an Atlantic alliance which is full of freedom, and all of the left-wing West joined it. The Shanghai Organization is not a bloc, it's a military alliance. So by using the word bloc, we are increasing the population's fear. We are creating instability for businesses, and we are deceiving the public by saying that we're on the verge of a worldwide declaration. So, okay, tectonics of blocks is not the right phrase. What would you choose? Well, I'm a former ambassador, and I worked with Hubert Védrine, and so we worked on the concepts. So we are in a group where there are three huge subgroups. There's the NATO, enlarged NATO, with Japan and all the rest, South Korea. We've got the world of the BRICS, Shanghai, which is heading in there, and then we've got the others, which we mentioned, i.e. those who are excluded, those who are on the outskirts of history. Well, my question is to say that we should get out of this term, not use this term, because it's very frightening if you're saying that we're living in a world of blocks. It means that we're on the eve of the war. I do not believe that we're on the eve of an international war. Arantxa, do you want to come back? Are we living in a world of blocks or not? Are we on the verge of war? Well, I haven't got a crystal ball, but what I can say is that there is a risk of fragmentation in terms of the governance of the world. And that fragmentation risk is very clear in terms of the economy and trade with part of the world that would follow certain commercial rules, and another part of the world which is following other commercial rules, and a third part of the world which has to choose between which of the other two blocks it wants to trade. And that is a risk that exists. But having said that, does one imagine then that we're heading towards a third world war? But I haven't a clue. But I think we have to identify how we can avoid this fragmentation. Not only in ideology, politics, and the economy, we have to go beyond that. This is a question which needs to be addressed. Jean-Marc Alamy, no, we're not looking towards war. We've got in our mind continued globalization. I've already explained that. I think we're going to have the world breaking down into regions, and the outlines of these regions will become clearer, I think, in the coming years. We fear that if there is this mindset of blocks, then we're going to have to make a choice. But that is not what we are seeing. That is not what we are promoting. All of the colleagues who I work with, who are at the head of companies, they're all striving towards globalization. They will have the most benefit from globalization, and that's what the businessmen and women are saying. But are politicians listening to us? Who knows? Well, thank you very much. Is there any more questions from the floor? Yeah, Guillaume Cloussard. I used to work at the European Commission, Council rather. So, as has been rightly said, we need to be dynamic. We know that during a war, industrialists, scientists, politicians all got together to make sure that Europe existed. That dynamic is no longer with us, sadly, because there's Davos, etc. They're not really talking about European strategy. So the Europeans don't have a platform where they can talk about what the future holds. And if you don't have a platform to talk about the ideas, then you can't defend your ideas. So how do we go about creating these? The second question is for Sir Peter about the alliances. Yes, I know that about these alliances, but when you go to New York or to Washington, you see that there are more people who are looking towards war among the Democrats, thinking that Europe will follow, and they're taking advantage of that to get people to drop out technologically speaking, politically speaking, and if the Europeans take leadership in technology, then we will have a discussion, then we can be a leader. But so how do we create that technological leadership? Because the very fundamental problem is the same as China is facing. So, Ambassador, would you like to come back on this question of alliances? Okay, dropping out. Well, that's not what the Americans are looking for. They are looking for a breach with China. And I don't like to use the word block, but centers of interest, perhaps, instead, sketched out by financial, economic systems, digital systems, the separate internets. So they're two separate worlds where the risks have been removed from, and the Americans are seeing Europe and Asiatic allies and us with them, all in that same sphere, that center of interest. But there is American protectionism. There are going to be the elections, and so they are being protectionist. And that will foster nationalization of the supply chain and new technologies. And we have to combat that. We have to try and work with our friends rather than renationalize technology and supply chains. We've got a final question from the room. We've only got 5 minutes remaining. So the gentleman has a question there. A quickie. Well, thank you very much for giving me the mic. I'm Jean Gilbert. I work in the social services, and my question is taken through the looking glass of Africa. So today we're talking about energy transitioning and biodiversity. There is one country which is 4 times bigger than France, and it's the RDC. I want to know what is the relationship between the African continent and France and Europe via this country, RDC, which is being presented as a solution in terms of energy transitioning and biodiversity. Thank you very much. And a final question, and we can answer both of those at the same time. Arantxa, will you talk about Africa and Europe? And there's a young gentleman here at the front. Tell us who you are and what your question is. Hello, Enzo Menestre. I'm a student. You've all rightly talked about European unity in terms of that possible conflict between China and the States. Can that European unity not be called into question when we see all of these liberal democracies rising to the surface? In Hungary, since Orbán arrived, and also to a lesser extent in Poland and Slovakia, is this European unity not threatened by those very liberal regimes? Well, Hubert Védrine talked about the unity of Europe. You have a vision of what awaits us, given the different political shifts in different countries. Too many interesting questions here at the end of our session. It's just a shame. The difficult thing that we have here is finding the correct terms to define each situation. Globalization, for example, fragmentation, splitting, de-risking, blocks, not blocks. So over 20 to 30 years, we were using very simple terms. They were so inaccurate in macroeconomics, geopolitics, and globalization. The words just didn't really mean anything anymore, and it wasn't working as people were expecting. So it all exploded in all kinds of formula. For example, an international community, that's a term that you'll hear all the time. There is no international community. The term of community is a very warm term. But if you're in a community with Putin or with China or with the Islamists, well, there's many, many words which are weighing down our discussions and our seminars. So we have no longer any idea what we're talking about. So you have to spend a quarter of an hour defining your vocabulary. We'll talk about Europe. Well, I'm for subsidiarity. I think that Europe should focus on essential issues, i.e. defending its civilization from the rest of the world. And I don't think that is what the European Parliament's job is, to homogenize all of these countries. That wouldn't work anyway. I think today we need an integrationist treaty which hasn't been signed, and it would not be ratified anyway. So as far as Europe is concerned, I would say that we need a historical deal, an agreement, a contract between European elites and the populations who have just given in. There aren't a lot of pro-Europeans in the population. There is a tiny minority of anti-Europeans. There's a huge minority of Eurosceptics. And let's not take the word skeptical as being hostile. There are Eurosceptics. They could become pro-European if Europe were to redefine its goals in a more concrete and more structured, strategic way. Thank you, Hubert Védrine. And Ambassador Ricketts, and then Arantxa will wrap up. We haven't forgotten that question about Africa and Europe. Yes, I'd just like to come back on the question of European unity. In my opinion, we need to stop imagining that you can put all countries in the same mold. The idea of integration, a single European model, that doesn't work. We need to accept diversity, difference. Difference can be a strength. And that's one thing. And then to say a thing about the UK, we have to learn how to live with a third-party country which was a member, an important member, remains a military power. And it's important to find a new way of cooperating between this third-party country, which is also a friend and a partner of all countries in Europe. Okay, Arantxa now, wrap it up. Africa is the only place in the world where we know we can across 3 things: a competitive economy, solidarity, and democracy. And if we lose democracy, then we are not Europe. In Europe, we have to take care of our own democracy here without thinking of other countries. That's what makes Europe, Europe, our democracy. Coming on to Africa now. Africa is facing the same difficulties as Europe. Africa does not want a world where you've got the East against the West and you'd have to choose one or the other, and that is why Europe needs to pay more attention to the needs and to the interests and to the opportunities in Africa. And I think some words have been said that you have to take a closer look at Africa, and Africa which is working more with Europe, with more partnerships, starting on the subject of climate change, where Europe and Africa have both done their duty. They didn't really have a duty because they account for 1% of emissions around the world, but together we must fight to make sure that others' emissions can be reduced if we hope to continue to live on this planet. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause and enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the conferences.